All right, this is a pleasure and an honor. There he is, Bronson Arroyo. How you doing, man?
I'm doing good. Can't complain.
Where are you? You down in Florida? I know your father, and our thoughts and prayers are with him, your dad, Gus, that he's been going through some tough times physically, and you've been down there taking care of him and keeping an eye on him. How's he doing?
He's doing better. Got him out of the hospital. He's functional in his own house, which is what you're looking for. I mean, being in a hospital or in a facility is just absolutely miserable. It's so sterile, So it was nice to get him back in his own space. And I'm actually back in Cincinnati now. I've got a show on Saturday night here, a tribute show. So we're in town for a little band practice tonight.
What's the show? Where is it? And what's it for?
It's at the Madison Theater. I actually don't know what it's for. I usually say yes to everything without even knowing the details. And I know it's four tribute bands are playing though. I think it's an REM band, a Green Day band, I think Smashing Pumpkins, and then we're doing a Pearl Jam set last. And it's about 7 to 11 at the Madison Theater in Kentucky. And we'll probably be doing about 10 songs. I think that's what everybody's probably doing.
Cool. Do all the guys in your band, are they guys from Cincinnati, or are they guys from different parts of the country?
In this band, I kind of have two bands. One is these are all Cincinnati guys. These are guys that I started playing with in 2006 when I got traded from the Red Sox, and I just put out that cover album called Covering the Bases, and that was put out by Warner Brothers, and they were asking me if I still wanted to play some music, and so I said, yeah, I would love to. So they put this band together for me. We've been playing ever since.
When you think about I've always wondered this because for those of us who weren't good enough at music, for those of us who weren't good enough to be a Major League Baseball pitcher, I'm sure you've been asked this question before, but I find it an interesting question. Do you get more of the rush and the adrenaline and all of those things when you're up there on a stage and you're playing a huge event out in spring training, just announced a few days ago? I think Eddie Vedder's going to be out there right when spring training gets started, if I'm not mistaken, this coming March or February. Do you get more of all of those things from being on the mound, pitching in a major league game, or being up on the stage?
It used to be I was more nervous on the stage for sure. And part of that is due to the fact that, when you're pitching in a major league arena, most of the time you don't feel like you're pitching for the fans. You feel like you're pitching for yourself and for your teammates, right? You're pitching for the organization, and the fans are kind of a secondary thing, like an outer ring of that. And hopefully they appreciate your performance and that you do well for them as well. But it's not the primary goal. Musically, you feel like people bought a ticket to hear the music, and if you fail them, there's nothing to hide behind. It's like you feel like they didn't get their money's worth. And so baseball wise, if I got my butt kicked at the stadium, let's say by the Pirates on any given day, I'd feel like I let myself down, I let the team down, but I wouldn't necessarily feel like I let the fans down, because they were there for the entertainment, and it's kind of in sports, it's win, lose, or draw. You don't know what's going to happen. But musically, you don't feel like you should go up on the stage and just bomb it. And so I used to be much more nervous musically, but these days I've played a lot more shows and played with a band, and you get comfortable up there and you feel like there's really nothing that can go so wrong that people would really notice. So it's been pretty comfortable the last couple of years.
So when you're cruising around and you got the ear pods in and you're listening to music, what are the 2 or 3 bands that you find yourself, and maybe it's not limited to 2 or 3, but if you were limited to 2 or 3 bands that you had to listen to on a regular basis, what bands would they be?
Yeah, if I was on a deserted island and I could only take three bands with me, I think it would definitely be Pearl Jam. It would probably be the Beatles, and then it'd probably be the Lumineers. I find that those 3 bands I could listen to over and over and over again. There's much more music out there that I enjoy, but those never seem to get old. I could play them 24/7 in the background of my life, and they feel like I don't get tired of it.
Let's go to the background of your life a little bit. Talked about your dad, Gus, your mom, Judy. You're born down in the Florida Keys back in February of '77. Your father, correct me if I'm wrong, originally from Cuba. Is that right?
Yeah, my father was born in Cuba in 1950 and migrated to the Keys when his his parents decided that they were seeing the handwriting on the wall, that they thought that was when Batista ran the country before Castro took over. And my grandfather actually was kind of in the clique and the crew, which was called the July 26th movement, kind of helping Castro take over the country because they thought he was going to make it a democracy, and he didn't. So they wound up staying in the Keys.
Okay, so you get down the Keys, you're born there, and then you move to a town, Brooksville, Florida, where you go to Hernando High School, and you're a great athlete there. You're playing basketball, you're pitching in baseball, the whole 9 yards. You've got college baseball scholarship offers, that kind of thing. I want to backtrack a second, though. When you do move, what was life like in the Arroyo house on a day-to-day basis? What was it like growing up in Florida?
For the most part, I had a bit of a strange upbringing. We lived on 3.5 acres when we moved from the Keys. We had this property that had these beautiful oak trees with the Spanish moss hanging down. And it was cow fields, basically. You're not living in Florida where you're on the coast. You're not living near the ocean anymore as we were in the Keys. And we always had a weight room in my house. My father was in this culture where he had been lifting weights with his friends for a long time. And this was like serious. They come home from work and these guys they were benching somewhere between 400 and 500 pounds. They were squatting between 600 and 700 pounds, and the same thing on the deadlift. And so he saw me as a kid who could play catch as a 5 and 6 year old in a way that I'd never been taught. And he just saw athleticism that was, above and beyond the average kid. And so he thought, I'll put him in the weight room and make him a little stronger, at least get him a free education in college. So in my house, it was kind of wake up, have a good breakfast, go to school, come home, get a little snack. We'd go down and do our baseball thing, which was playing, stretching, warming up, playing catch, probably throwing a bullpen to a tire that was cemented onto a bucket, taking some ground balls, hitting in a batting cage, and then getting in the weight room and doing 45 minutes to an hour of a workout. Go inside, take a shower, do your homework, eat some dinner, and go to sleep and do it all over again.
I read where, and you talked about the weightlifting thing, I read where, and with the Cuban background, although Castro wasn't in power yet, your dad was one of those guys, and correct me, Bronson, if I'm wrong here, the Russians and the East Germans and all these kinds of guys were doing weightlifting a little bit different than maybe some of the people were doing at that time in the United States, and that's the kind of stuff you were doing. Is that accurate, or am I wrong on that?
Yeah, not so much in the lifts that we were doing, but the dedication to the craft at a young age. You would hear about Russian athletes just being, bred from the time they were 3 and 4 years old, whether they were an Olympic wrestler or if they were, a snatcher or a clean and jerk guy, whatever. You just got them started a little bit earlier. And my father really bought into that philosophy. I can remember many times as a kid being 7 and 8 years old and people walking up to my father and saying, "Oh, we hear that your son's, squatting, 200 pounds at age 6. And they would say, that's going to stunt his growth. You're crazy. I don't think you should be doing these things." And he just was a little bit more ahead of his time. He was taking me to the acupuncturist. He was taking me to the chiropractor. I was getting full body massages as a kid. He treated me like an athlete. And he just saw that was the way that you could achieve anything in life, which was kind of like to put one foot in front of the other and really pay attention to the details. Other people had not really caught up to that yet. And so he looked like a bit of a quack for a while. But as time has gone on, it's proven that he was kind of on the right track and put me in a place that gave me the ability to play, 15 years in the big leagues. Otherwise, it would have never happened.
Now, correct me if I'm wrong. You have a chance to go to college on a scholarship, play baseball, great basketball player, all those kinds of things. But you get drafted in the 3rd round by the Pirates. I'm assuming you weren't a hard thrower, but I don't know what the importance in the mid-'90s was like as it is now to go draft a hard thrower. Would you be drafted in the 3rd round today with the stuff that you had then compared to what it seems like they're only looking for now?
Probably not. I think it would have taken a very, very special scout, which I feel like the guy who drafted me, his name is Scott Lovecamp. He's still with the Yankees. Working with their pitching, in the entire organization. And I feel like he was special enough to be aware of my feel, of the ability to change arm angles, to change tempos, the wit, the craftiness I had between my ears to beat hitters. At a very young age, I was doing a lot of these things. Most scouts probably wouldn't have leaned on that so heavy and drafted me in the 3rd round these days, because I was throwing, in high school, I was throwing probably 86 to 88. And on a good day, I would touch 90. in my prime, let's say 2006, I was probably throwing, 87 to 92. And most days I was still living in that 86 to 88 range. So I never really was a hard thrower, but I always had the ability to throw my secondary pitches for strikes, right? And when you can do that at age 18, a lot of times you then don't walk a lot of guys in the big league level, right? Command seems to be something that is built into the machine early on, and they're starting to realize that now. But back in 1995, that wasn't so much aware on the table. They thought they could teach everyone everything from the time you were drafted on. And so I think I would have been drafted, but it would have been probably later in the draft. I probably would have had a more of an uphill battle trying to get to the big leagues, throwing under 90 miles an hour most of the time. But I still always feel like the cream rises to the top. You find a way to get it done if you're a winner. And I feel like I could have always competed at the big league level.
All right, so you get in the Pirates organization. You're there working your way up to the big leagues. What do you remember about your major league debut?
Oh man, I remember a lot. It was, first I remember I was in Colorado Springs. Our manager at the time in AAA was Trent Jewett. He had got sent up in mid-season from being a AAA manager to the big leagues to coach third base. The Pirates had fired their first and third base coach, and so the hitting coach had actually taken over the manager's job there in AAA. We're playing in Colorado Springs. And he calls me into the office and he says, I got two things. I got one bad news and I got some good news. Which one you want first? And I said, I'll take the bad news. He said, the bad news is you're not pitching today. And this was Richie Hebner, a legendary Pirates player.
Yeah.
And, and kind of a guy who could be irritated very easily, right? He was always on edge. He loved me, but it's what we call in the game a red ass, right? A guy who can be, you say one thing and he's pissed off. So, I wasn't sure what I was getting from him. He said, the bad news is you're not pitching today. He said, the good news is you're going to pitch against the Braves on Wednesday. And so it was, that was the realization of that moment, all those childhood days in the weight room that was coming to fruition. And so I get to Pittsburgh. I remember it was a rainy day. There was no batting practice. I walked into the stadium having no idea that you weren't supposed to wear a suit to home games. And I walked in with my one cheap suit I had, and guys got a kick out of that and were kind of laughing at me as I walked in. And I remember sitting on the bench that very first day, actually pregame, I was getting dressed and I was putting on some spikes. And a friend of mine, Jimmy Anderson, who I'd played with in the minor leagues a lot, he said, what are you doing putting on those spikes? And I said, I've been pinch running in AAA a lot. So I'm always used to putting them on. And he said, man, ain't nobody going to pinch hit in the big leagues here. He said, put your tennis shoes on and man, enjoy yourself. So we get out to the bench. I'm sitting there in Three Rivers Stadium, right? I haven't been in a big league ballpark like that, especially where you couldn't see out the back of the stadium. All minor league ballparks, you can see out into the back. But just having those seats there changed the landscape. The AstroTurf was different. You felt like you were in a different place. I'm looking across the field. I see Greg Maddux. I see John Smoltz. I see Thom Glavine. I'm seeing these guys that were absolute idols of mine as a kid. And I'm just enjoying the game. And in the third inning, I hear, Arroyo. And I say, yeah. And they say, we want you to hit. And I said, I've got tennis shoes on. And they said, don't worry about it. It's good dirt in there. We need you to pinch hit. So I'm literally find myself on the on-deck circle with no contacts in my eyes, half blurry vision, with a pair of tennis shoes on, about to make my major league debut as a hitter.
You got to be kidding me. You don't have contacts in? These guys are throwing 90 miles an hour. I mean, the tennis shoes, okay, but you got no contacts in?
Yeah, I had no contacts in. My eyes since high school had been like 20, 25, 20, 30. So you could get away with normal life not wearing them. But on the field, it was very difficult to be really good without those contacts in. So it was doable, but it was hazy for sure. And I got up there against a guy, luckily I knew well, named Bruce Chen. We had played against each other in the minor leagues for a long time. He was with the Atlanta Braves all those years, and he wasn't a hard thrower, and I kind of knew his repertoire. So it made me feel comfortable enough, but still making your major league debut, kind of sliding around on the dirt in some tennis shoes without being able to see the ball crystal clear was a bit odd.
All right, what about the first game now, though, you get a chance to pitch in?
So the next night I get a chance to pitch in. I don't remember a ton about the game. I can remember the feeling of the game. I know I got a no decision. I think I went 5 innings, gave 4 runs if I remember correctly. But it was an uncomfortable feeling. It was, I'd been pitching in the minor leagues for a long time, very loose, very free and easy, pitching off the top of my head, pitching backwards, just really playing a chess match with hitters. And I get to the big league level, and the Pirates, they kind of took that away from me. They were kind of like, hey, Jason Kendall is an all-star. He's been here for a few years. Why don't you just go with what he wants you to throw? And they really didn't want me to shake him off a whole lot. And it was also something people don't realize, the subtleties of what it's like to be comfortable out on the field. I'm pitching on a mound that I had never been on. I'm inside a stadium now that feels a little different. I'm wearing a uniform that's much tighter than I'm used to. I'm at the big league level and they give me a uniform that's more snug in the pants. I'm used to wearing this very baggy kind of hand-me-down uniform from years and years in AAA that feels almost like a pair of pajamas, and you're very comfortable. And so there's these subtleties that you don't realize can bother you out there. And, I felt like I was in a straitjacket, kind of throwing uphill into the wind the whole night. You couldn't really get on the hitters. You didn't feel like you could finish people. And by the end of that night, I kind of knew I was in a different place, and I knew it was going to take some time to get comfortable.
You're there a couple of years, and then you eventually get claimed on waivers by the Boston Red Sox. Before we get to the Red Sox, as a very young man, and I love picking brains of guys where this has happened to. I mean, the game's littered with guys who number one picks and everything just kind of falls into place. When you get claimed on waivers, or the team that drafted you puts you on waivers, do you start wondering if you got it to make it, or did you never lose that confidence?
At that time, I had never lost the confidence up to that point. Had it happened a second time with the Boston Red Sox, and I would have kind of lingered in AAA and gotten claimed off waivers a second time, I think some of that doubt would have crept in. But what I had observed in the 8 years that I was with the Pirates was that, I was a winner at the minor leagues. I had like 80 wins. I think I have 84 to this day, but at that time I probably had close to 80 wins in the minor leagues. I was 40 games over 500. I knew I was out pitching guys who were drafted higher than me that were, maybe top prospects in the organization, where I wasn't valued in the same way because I wasn't a hard thrower. But everybody, when you're inside a locker room, you can't fake it, right? People know who the real deal is. They know who guys who can muster it up in those, in those tough times when you got second and third and nobody out. The guys who take care of their body, the guys that work hard in the weight room, the guys that aren't lazy, right? That their word means something. All these things kind of permeate your character in the game. And I was a guy who I knew people inside of the room I was in could feel that I was here, I was serious, and that I wasn't going anywhere. And so when the Pirates let me go, I was a little surprised for sure, because I had so much success at the minor league level. I thought I was knocking on the door of being in that rotation for a long time. And, they just didn't quite at the big league level see my value that everyone else had seen at the minor leagues. And so they let me go on waivers, and I got to the Red Sox. I wasn't really sure what I was going to get, but I quickly realized that every organization functioned very differently. And at that time, I hadn't even thought about the fact that I wasn't going to play in the big leagues for a decade. I mean, it just wasn't on my radar at all.
So you get to Boston in 2004. You're in middle relief to start. You work your way into the rotation. You've been asked about this a ton of times, and about when you hit Alex Rodriguez of the Yankees in July of that year. I don't know where the Red Sox were that year. The rivalry, whether teams are good or bad or both, or one's good, the other one's bad, it doesn't matter. It's such a heated rivalry. But was that moment, not that you planned to hit Alex Rodriguez, but did that moment become almost a galvanizing type of moment for that Boston Red Sox team?
Yeah, people credit that with kind of launching of the awakening of the Red Sox to coming back and being down 3-0 in that series and winning that World Series. And people really point at that. And, it felt galvanizing at the time, but, we wouldn't have had to fight those guys to feel like we were galvanized. I think just Alex purely coming to that team, if you know a bit of history kind of the Billy Beane story and where Alex came from, he wanted to be a Red Sox, and the union wouldn't really allow it because they were going to have to take some money off the table in his contract. So he wound up being a Yankee kind of as a second choice. And, we had been battling those guys since 2003. Aaron Boone hits the home run in Game 7, and I'm warming up in the bullpen that year and really devastated us. We were up 5 games. we were up 5-1 with 5 outs left to go in the game with Pedro Martinez on the mound. And so this thing has really been building for a while. And then you infuse Alex into that lineup, an already great team. It just the guy who Alex was, who could kind of rub people the wrong way over his career with a bit of cockiness and brashness and how good he was, You know, it just left turned the fire up even more in 04. And so when I hit him that day, you know, and him and Jason Varitek go at it, I mean, Varitek was what really was the captain of that ball club in every sense of the word. And for those two giants to kind of go at it, it definitely galvanized that team. I can remember being in the clubhouse after winning that game when Bill Miller hits a home run on Mariano Rivera and kind of brings us back from the dead there. And Theo Epstein was in the locker room. All the guys who had been kicked out of the game were in the locker room. And people were celebrating almost like we won a playoff game. And from then on, you know, things started turning in our direction. So it was it definitely felt like it was something.
Well, it really turned in your direction, and I'm not sure, maybe you're not even able to do it. You're an eloquent guy, but I don't know. But you had been around there long enough, only a couple of years, to know the whole vibe of Red Sox baseball. You know, look, I had a chance to broadcast Major League Baseball for over 30 years, and it wasn't until I had a few days off during the season back in 07, 08, 09, something like that, and my wife and I went up to Maine for a few days, and we're there, and I mean starting at 6 o'clock, man, in Maine. This isn't in Boston. This is in Maine. Everybody and his brother is locked into watching the Boston Red Sox on some random night in June or July or August, whatever it is. Is there any way to put into words what that season culminating in finally winning the World Series, what that was like to be in Boston that summer?
Yeah, I've often tried to tell stories that can make even other players understand, because even when I came to Cincinnati and any place I played afterwards, people would always ask me, even veteran guys of the game, they would say, is it really that much different to play in New England? And from my experience, it absolutely was. And, I can remember being in the playoffs before we went to the World Series. I was probably, I would say I was the 15th most popular guy on that team, right? I mean, you had Johnny Damon, you had Manny Ramirez, David Ortiz, Derek Lowe. I mean, Tim Wakefield. These guys, Tim Wakefield wins 200 games. Derek Lowe wins 175. I'm still the last man on the totem pole behind Pedro Schilling and these guys. And I won 148 plus 84 in the minor leagues, and they totally outshined my career. So I felt like the water boy a lot of times on that team. And I could go anywhere in New England. And I mean anywhere. I could go to a truck stop in northern Vermont, and people would come up to you absolutely freaking out, wanting to take a picture with you and shaking while they were taking a picture with you. This is going to the hospital and having the nurse not be able to draw your blood. And she says to you, the last time this happened to me, I couldn't get the needle in someone's arm. It was Bruce Springsteen, right? Like stuff like that. And I can't imagine what it would be like to be Pedro Martinez or Johnny Damon at that time. And so, the couple of things that I like to say about after we won the World Series was, first of all, the cemeteries were full the next day. People were going to the gravestones of their parents and their grandparents and reading newspaper articles to them. That's how much it meant to that city. And the other thing was that nobody ever would come up to me and say, congratulations, you guys won the World Series. They would say, thank you. Thank you for my family. Thank you for bringing a peace of mind to the people who are alive and the people that are dead. And it was very profound. I felt the love from there. And it was part of the reason why I was so heartbroken to be traded to the Cincinnati Reds at the time, because I felt the passion in the people in New England. And I hadn't felt that anywhere else in the game.
All right, so let's skip ahead to that. The next year you have your best year. You win 14 games. You pitch over 200 innings for the first time. You've got it going on. You sign this 3-year contract to stay in Boston. You've said yourself it was a quote-unquote hometown discount for all the reasons that you're talking about right now. And then all of a sudden you find out you're getting traded to Cincinnati. What did you think when you heard? Where were you when you were told that? And what went through your mind, not only sitting there hearing it, but then maybe when you got in your car to drive away or just spend time alone thinking about how did this just happen?
Yeah, it was a very odd day that's very, very vivid in my mind. It was nearing the end of spring training, and I was feeling good about where I was at. I had a couple of good outings and a couple of mediocre ones in spring, but I knew I was cemented on the club at that time. I had already established myself as a major league player. And so I wasn't worried about, my performances so much. It was about trying to get healthy and making sure that you were strong enough to start the season and not be hurt. And so I was pitching against the Orioles that day. I remember I had a buddy named Joe Maston in town. His sister was there. We were having some lunch afterwards under this big tent right outside the stadium. And I'd finished that covering the bases record, and there was this part in the song Everlong by the Foo Fighters that you couldn't really understand what Dave Grohl was mumbling in the background. And so we had Stephen King, the writer, the legendary writer, listen to the record and ask him if he would do a spoken word part and write a part for it. And he said, let me listen to the record, and if I think it's good music, I'll do it. And so he said he signed on for it. And so he had done this part, and we had never met in person. We had talked on the phone, and Stephen walked by, and he shook my hand, and we had a great conversation that day. And I remember I left the ballpark just on a high. I had a good outing. You know, the season's about to start, and I was headed back to my hometown of Brooksville. I'm driving 3 hours from Fort Myers up to my house, and I'm thinking about what I need for the season. I'm going to pack my stuff. I'm going to get it loaded, and we're heading to Boston here to start the season. And I'm at my house, and I was talking with one of my childhood buddies on the phone, and Theo Epstein clicked in on the second line. And I saw his name, and on the drive up, I had somebody who had called me and said, hey, there's whispers in the air that you might be traded for a guy named Willie Mo Pena. But I had been in those type of conversations for such a long time. I never took them seriously, right? I just signed an undervalued deal for 3 years. I think Boston loves me. I'm the youngest guy in the rotation. I gave him the most quality starts the year before. It's like, it didn't make sense to me. And sure enough, Theo clicks over and he says, I say, hello. And he says, hey, Bronson. He said, I got something I don't really want to tell you. And I said, you traded me for Willie Mo Pena? And he said, yeah. And it was a super short conversation. And I said, okay, I'll see you at the ballpark tomorrow. And I hung up because I was so agitated. You know, I felt like it was the first time in my life that I felt a bit of betrayal, because when I signed that deal, Theo was not there at the time. He had left the organization for a bit, and I was dealing with Jed Hoyer and Ben Sherrington as co-general managers of the club. And they assured me that I was not going to be traded, or that there was no plans to trade me anytime soon. And so it only been 4 or 5 weeks since I'd signed that deal, and I was really just heartbroken by it.
Okay, so you go to Cincinnati. This is a team that had been really down, and to be honest, maybe you totally disagree. I just thought the whole vibe in the clubhouse, because I came shortly thereafter, and I just, to me, it looked like a lazy clubhouse. I'm not asking you to say that. It lacked intensity, it lacked fire, and here you had left the place that had all of those things. When you come to the Reds, right out of the gate, your first year, you go to the All-Star game. You throw over 240 innings that year. What was different? Was anything different about Bronson Arroyo as a pitcher, as a man, during that first season with Cincinnati?
Yeah, you know, being battle tested in the American League East, pitching on such a large stage all the time, not only in the playoffs against the Yankees and against St. Louis in the World Series, but from 2003, from being in that playoff series against the Yankees there. You know, we had a grind of a series against Oakland in the first round in 2003 that we barely escaped, with Derek Lowe closing that game out there on that front.
I did that game. I did that game for Fox. I remember it well.
Yeah. And, you know, those couple of years really made me feel like I was playing on another level. It made you know that you could play at the highest level, get comfortable, and get the job done. And so when I get traded over to Cincinnati, I don't know much about the National League, but I do know at the time, but I do know that I've got the 9-hole hitter is now going to be a pitcher. I don't think the lineups are as strong as the American League East. And I'm coming off of, you know, pitching in places that made me feel like, you know, this is as good as it's ever going to get. Plus, physically, I was 27, 28 years old. It was right in my prime. I had figured out my repertoire of pitches. I was throwing a bit harder than I probably had ever had in my career. I could get up to 90, 91, 92 if I needed to, a little more often. And, you know, I just got off to a good start. The city embraced me a bit. I could tell that there was a lack of fire around the place. I could feel it in the city, but you saw people coming alive. You know, I can remember one time I was at a place called Jillian's that doesn't exist anymore here in Cincinnati, and I was at a urinal, and there was a guy next to me, and I had pitched about 3 or 4 times, and there was a guy next to me looking at the bathroom attendant, and he was saying like, hey, this kid Arroyo is amazing, man. He's lighting a fire in the city, not knowing I was standing right next to him. At the urinal next to him. And, you know, you could feel that around town a little bit, that something was changing a little bit. And I wasn't totally aware of it, but I did feel like I was kind of skating downhill. It was one of those times when you caught a streak in your career where you felt unbeatable for a while. And, you know, it wasn't a lot different about me. It was mostly between my ears and the confidence levels that I had to be pitching at the big league level at that time.
But Bronson, it had to feel like, and again, I'm saying this, not you, But it had to feel like, and maybe I'm totally wrong, it had to feel like after you walk out of Boston and you come to Cincinnati, it's like you've gone from the big leagues to the minor leagues at that point in time, at least as far as fandom is concerned, as far as passion, as far as the level of the team, the expectations of the team. There had to be, maybe I'm wrong, there had to be some kind of letdown there besides the betrayal part you talked about. But I'm talking about physically putting on a major league uniform in Cincinnati compared to what you were putting on just months before in Boston.
Absolutely. There was. I mean, and I can tell you subtle things that people, might not realize. But when I first walked into the Reds locker room and realized that they didn't have any breakfast, any food, they didn't have a kitchen, we didn't have a chef, we didn't have a masseuse, right? You didn't have an acupuncturist, right? There was a lot of amenities that we had in Boston in a time when a lot of teams didn't have that we were lacking in Cincinnati. I remember that very first day I walked into the locker room, there was no one in there except for Aaron Harang, Kent Merker, and Ken Griffey Jr. And everybody came over to say hi to me. I remember when I walked in the door, Kent Merker screamed out, "Our karaoke team just got a little bit better." and Ken Griffey came over and said hi, and their beat writers were there. And I really didn't know Aaron Harang much. We pitched against each other the year before, but he was young in his career, and I wasn't paying attention to the National League much. And so I realized he was the number one on this staff. But I walked into Jerry Naren's office as the manager, and he had been with the Red Sox just a couple of years earlier with me. And so I sat down and he said, "Bronson, I know you're disappointed to be here." He said, "I'm disappointed to be here." And because he had known where we had come from. And so, I realized that there were some changes here. The ballpark wasn't as nice in Sarasota. It needed an update, right? Everything felt like it needed an update. But there was one guy on the staff, the strength coach, Matt Krause, that I had been with for many years in the minor leagues. And I did not know he was the big league strength coach until the day I walked in there. And he made me feel very comfortable. He made me feel at home. He made me feel like the program that I was bringing from the Red Sox, I could continue with that, and they weren't going to change me too much. And that comfort level just coming from him made it that much easier to kind of get in that uniform and kind of push away some of that petty stuff and just see if we could win ball games.
Slowly but surely, roster starts to turn over. You start bringing in some guys that look like they have a chance to be really good, headlined, of course, by Joey Votto. Jay Bruce comes along, and now you get to 2010. And there's certainly a vibe about the team that feels like this team can win. That night when Jay Bruce hits the home run to send the Reds into the postseason for the first time in seemingly forever, I know it wasn't a sellout crowd that night, but it was a great crowd that night. It may not be on par necessarily, certainly not on par with winning a World Series playing in Boston, but that had to be one really cool moment for you and a bunch of guys that you sort of saw come together over a number of years after you arrived.
Absolutely. When I got there in 2006, like you said, there was a different landscape there, right? We had Rich Aurelia playing shortstop and third base as a utility guy. We had Scott Hatterberg at first base. Ryan Friel was on the club. You still had Ken Griffey Jr. Your starting catcher was supposed to be Jason LaRue, who got hurt, and David Ross kind of took over that role with me at the same time. But it was a totally different ball club than we had in 2010. And the old guard was there, and what you talked about with a little bit of a lack of intensity. I would say that was kind of Adam Dunn and Ken Griffey Jr.'s team at the time. And those guys, I felt like, were used to having a good offense and terrible pitching, and they knew they probably weren't going to make the playoffs. And there was this feeling in the locker room of kind of like go along to get along, and we'll come in fourth place and we'll do it again next year and we'll do the best we can, but maybe we're not going anywhere. And by the time kind of that team slowly started to disintegrate because they were of age and because of a few trades, and you started hearing in the pipeline about this guy named Johnny Cueto. People are still talking about Homer Bailey, but they're saying, hey, we got a guy named Cueto, he's even better, right? And then we get Mike Leake, and you're hearing Joey Votto and Jay Bruce, and there's this buzz coming in the minor leagues that I hadn't heard in my Pirate days really ever, of this group of guys that's coming in that we think is going to be pretty good. And then you infuse Dusty Baker in there as a manager who really can kind of make you feel like he's the commander of this ship and he's going to make it go. And so by 2010, when Jay hits that home run, it felt like a different team. It felt like a different space. It felt like we were ready to take off and do something special in the game.
during that postseason, you get no hit in the first game by the late Roy Halladay. You pitch great in your start, but the team gets swept, and on you go. 11 was a disappointment, but now 2012 comes along. I thought, you tell me if you agree or disagree, I thought that Reds team was the best team in the National League that year. Before we get to the playoffs, did you think going into the playoffs that this was a team, you had played on a World Series champion already, did you think this was a team built to win the whole thing?
You know, it's hard to say that sometimes because you're not ever inside other teams' locker rooms and you don't really know exactly how gritty they are, right? You can only observe that from the outside. But from observing our team from the inside, I felt like we had a team that was really close to winning a World Series at the time. I felt like the pitching staff probably lacked that real true number one guy at the time. And I also felt like we had a lineup that was a little bit too much swing and miss. And we could get really hot at times. But what I had observed in Boston was the way that we won those games was because of guys like Bill Miller, who I knew could put the ball in play against the best closer in the game, right? And in Cincinnati, it felt like that was the best team we'd had. And I thought we had a chance to win the World Series. But if I was being honest about exactly, betting my life on something, I felt like we were missing just a pinch of something, right? And it didn't mean that we couldn't do it because we could have. But I felt like it would have been solidified had we had one guy maybe playing in the outfield who hit 320 every year that you knew could put the ball in play that was a little harder to strike out. Because if you think about that lineup, you got Jay Bruce, who can be super hot, swing and miss. You got Drew Stubbs in center field, same thing. Right? You've got Brandon Phillips and Joey Votto on the right side of the field, and those are the grinders we're talking about. And, behind the plate's kind of the same thing. You've got guys who can make it happen at times, but it's a little bit this up and down, and you want to see something a little bit more flatlined. And I also felt like, honestly, myself, I had no business, I don't have any business going up against Clayton Kershaw or Justin Verlander head-to-head in a World Series game. Like, those guys are probably going to beat me more times than I beat them. Although we could get it done, Johnny Cueto wasn't quite that ace yet, right? So I felt like there was just a pinch of something missing, but you were hoping that we had enough.
You get to the postseason, and look, you get bad luck right out of the gate. I mean, the first inning of the game, Cueto's hurt. He was a number one guy. You come out, pitch a great game, 7 shutout innings in game 2. You're ahead 2-0. Win both games in San Francisco, you come back to Cincinnati. You come back to Cincinnati, a place where the team had not lost 3 games in a row at home all year long. All you got to do is win 1, best of 5. I remember, because we couldn't televise, I remember sitting up in the booth, and I'll never forget just the picture in my mind of looking down at the Giants dugout and seeing these guys jumping around. And Hunter Pence has got this huddle thing going on. I mean, look, they're a team in desperation. They got nothing to lose. When you're on the other side, I don't know if you saw that or if you thought, good Lord, what the hell are those guys doing over there? It's amateur hour. It looks like a college team, blah, blah, blah. Do you remember seeing it? What did you think about it? Because that started game 3. If I remember right, in that Giants dugout.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. We all, not everyone, but we either heard about it or you got to see a little bit of it. And, we knew Hunter from playing with the Astros, played against him since he was a rookie. We knew he had big time talent, kind of an unorthodox player, but he didn't really emerge as a personality on that club for those first few years. And by the time he gets over to San Francisco, he's now, wearing his hair a little bit differently, right? He's a guy who everyone knows wears his pants up to his knees, right? And he's this old school gritty guy who plays hard and he knows how to get the job done. And he had then blossomed in the game as a voice in that locker room. And guys like Buster Posey were great players, but they didn't have that same personality to bring people together. And so, with him doing that at the time, I mean, I don't think we thought much of it. I mean, we felt like we're back home. We've got 3 games. We just need to win one of these. If you remember in that rotation, Zito was kind of on the tail end of his career. He wasn't the same guy he was before. We didn't feel like they had anybody in that rotation. Even Bumgarner at the time, I had just beat him 7-0 or 9-0, whatever it was, and we didn't fear him at that time. He didn't really take off to be the Madison Bumgarner that we know now until the next year. And so, I don't think there was no panic on our part. And part of that led us to start Mike Leake in that series because Johnny Cueto went out instead of going with myself on 3 days rest and Matt Latos on 3 days rest. And that is the one thing about that series that still sticks in my side to this day, that I really wished we would have had the opportunity to not have Mike in the rotation, because I didn't think he was ready that year.
And you were close with Mike Leake, so it's not like you're sitting here taking some shot at some guy. I mean, he basically became your little brother from a second he went right from being drafted at Arizona State to pitching in the big leagues.
Absolutely. I took him under my wing. You know, I did everything I could to make him feel comfortable in that locker room. I love him to this day. You know, he's one of my favorite guys I've ever played with. He's quirky and he's different, and, you know, I like everything about him. But he just wasn't quite ready for that big stage yet, in my mind. Not to say that he couldn't have got the job done, but I felt like we had a better chance with myself and Latos going on 3 days rest in those moments. And I had that conversation with Brian Price. And I remember, because Johnny got hurt swinging the bat before game one. I was taking batting practice with Johnny on the field, and he said to me in Spanish, he said in Spanish, "I'm going to swing hard like this tonight, papi." And he said, "I'm going to swing duro." And he hit the first 3 balls of our batting practice really hard line drives to shortstop. And he winced, and he said, "Oh," and he didn't say, "I have a problem," but I know what happened. He pulled an oblique. And when I went in the locker room and he was getting prepped for the game, I knew he was in trouble, and I knew he probably wasn't going to make it through the game. But when we got back to Cincinnati, they pulled him off the playoff roster without allowing him to play catch. He went in the weight room, and they did a couple of things with him where he was testing it, and he said he felt pretty good, and they never allowed him to play long toss or play catch to see if he could still stay in on the roster, and they pulled him off of it. So when they pulled him off of it, I was disappointed by that, first of all, because I thought they should have given him a chance to play catch. But then I had a conversation with Brian Price, and I said, "Why don't you go 3 days rest with myself and Matt Latos?" And he said, "I don't think it's time to panic." He said, "We're going to go with what we have done all year, and we're going to put Mike in the rotation." And I just felt like at the time that Mike did not quite have the confidence in his game to step on that stage and really get the job done. Now, the years after that, I would have taken Mike Leake all day. But at that time, I felt like he was just, you know, underneath that.
I have often, just sitting back and watching through 30 years of good teams, bad teams, with the Cubs, the Diamondbacks, the Reds, been around to broadcast a team that won a World Series, and a lot of crappy teams along the way here or there. I still maintain, and you just pointed out with Hunter Pence, I still maintain it's very important to have a guy who's not afraid to step out of these lines we create in baseball, unlike football and basketball, that can step out and be a vocal leader. I felt like that 2012 team lacked that guy. You agree with that or disagree?
Yeah, I totally do. You know, it's, you know, if of anybody who probably, you know, threw a team party or, you know, made some of these undercurrent things go on that team, it was usually myself, right? I was the guy who was doing a lot of these things inside the Reds locker room, but it's very difficult to have a non-position player be the guy who's supposed to be the voice in a locker room, right? You need the guy who's playing shortstop every day. You need the guy who's playing center field every day. And on that club, what you needed was Joey Votto to be the voice of that team, or Scott Rowland, right? And both of those guys were great players, you know, and they were great teammates. But they weren't that vocal guy. They weren't that Johnny Gomes personality, right? They weren't that Ryan Dempster. They didn't have, you know, they weren't Pedro Martinez or the Kevin Millar, the guys who really stir the locker room. That Hunter Pence who just, you know, can be funny, can be witty, can also be harsh on teammates at times of need, right? And we did lack that a little bit. And you know, when Ryan Ludwig got to that team from the St. Louis Cardinals, he said to me one day on the bench, I'll never forget this. I said, "What do you think, Ryan? You've been watching us for about a month now. We weren't playing well." And he said, "I don't know how to explain it, but on the St. Louis Cardinals, it always felt like we had a hard stare." And he said, "Here in Cincinnati, it always feels a little lackadaisical." And that's what it always felt like in that locker room. Like we had a good team, but you were missing this one guy who was a spark plug to say, like, "No, guys, we are going to be here, right? And we are going to be here for the long haul." It always felt like we needed somebody a little bit more vocal from a position player.
You know, when you talk about the Cardinals, that doesn't surprise me at all. I mean, they had some great leaders, some young guys that were coming up at the time, especially the Yadier Molinas of the world and those kind of guys. But I think a lot of that started with their manager, Tony La Russa. He was a hard stare guy, whether it was midnight or whether it was, 4 o'clock in the afternoon. You'd walk in his office all the years that I'd do Fox games and say, how you doing? And he'd look you in the eye. He says, I'll tell you in about 6 hours. And he wasn't being flippant about it. He was ready to go for the game that night, whether it was July or in the postseason. I always felt like Frazier, Bronson could have been that guy. But I felt like, and again, I could be totally off base, but just kind of observing, I felt like Frazier was ready to be that guy, but I thought there were some other guys, position players on that team, that didn't want him to be that guy. Is that a stretch?
Well, if we're talking about 2012, you still got
Rowland, but Frazier had played very well that year. And to this day, There's still a lot of debate. And look, you can't fault Dusty Baker, Scott Rowland. I get it. But, I mean, right. Frazier was a big part of that team in helping it get to where it was. So whether it was 2012 or in subsequent years maybe is a better question. I felt like Frazier could have been that guy, but there were people around there, whoever it might be, and we don't have to sit here and name names, but I just felt like that there were people that didn't want him to be that guy.
Yeah, I could see that. When Scott was there in 12, Frazier was playing kind of a Pluton. He's playing a role where he's not playing every single day. He's playing off the bench. He's not an everyday player. And so when you're not an everyday player, it's very hard to be the guy who's leading the charge, right? If you're talking about years after that, I would agree with you. I think Frazier probably had the personality to do it, but inside of Frazier's personality is a lot of goofiness, right? He loves to be a jokester. And usually a guy on that team can be a jokester, but I could see where from the outside looking in, there might be some people who were a little bit leery of Todd in a way that maybe he joked around too much, right? Maybe he's not the guy to like fly the ship. He's like a good secondary guy, but he's not really the captain, right? And part of that, I just think, was his personality and the way that he went about his business. And like I said, in 12, when you had Scott there, he hadn't permeated that lineup enough yet to really be the guy to kind of pull the train.
You move on to the Diamondbacks. You sign as a free agent in 2013, and subsequently you start to go through some injuries and things like that. When a Major League Baseball player is injured, the easiest thing in the world for fans to do is sit around and, they're paying this guy all that money. You know what I'm saying here, right? But when you're that guy, is there a feeling of just incredible isolation? You're not always traveling with a team. You're not always feeling comfortable maybe when you come in the clubhouse because everybody's kind of looking at you, or you think people are looking at you and saying, oh, God, we're paying all this guy all this money and he can't play. Does that happen to a player?
Absolutely. I've probably had the least amount of insecurities, at least in the latter part of my career, of anybody who ever walked in a major league uniform. I was very confident in what I brought to the table and who I was as a person and the value that I felt other people appreciated from me, and even then it was the first time in my career that I wasn't traveling with the ball club, to sit at home and watch your team be in San Francisco. I had gone from 1995 to 2014 without missing a game. I had started over 450 games in a row, if you count the minor leagues, and some bullpen time in there. And I had never been on the disabled list, right? It was not in my DNA to not be with the club. And so just merely not to be traveling on the road was eating me up inside for a while, And then, like you said, let's say you're a younger guy who had some more insecurities, who wasn't as confident, hadn't built the bulk of a career that I had already done in Cincinnati. Sometimes, you walk past the general manager or the owner who had just, signed on the dotted line to pay you all this money. There's no doubt that guys would want to walk the other direction, put their head down in shame. Luckily for me, I had already been 19 and a half seasons, and I knew what I had done every fifth day for such a long time, had built an idea of who Bronson Arroyo was that I didn't have to hide my head in that way, you know. But even then, I remember being on the treadmill with the owner of the Diamondbacks, and he said, Bronson, when are you going to be back? I need you back out on the field. And he was kind of applying a little bit of pressure to me. And this was probably 3 months after I'd had Tommy John. So I wasn't nowhere near getting out on the field, and I was already 38 years old. And I felt some sort of obligation to the organization, you know, I just signed $23 million for 2 years, and I'd given them 7 wins, and I was leading the team after 14 starts. And I went out there 8 times with a tear in my shoulder and no ligament in my Tommy John, and they were trying to pull me out of the game. And I said, listen, I signed on the dotted line to pitch for you guys. I'm going to ride it till the very end. And I did. But, you know, after having those surgeries, I still felt very indebted to the organization that I wasn't giving them their money's worth.
You get a chance to come back. You finish up with the Reds. And before we get to the big news from last week about your election to the Reds Hall of Fame, you know, you made it cool. And I know that's a word it's used all the time. And, you know, is this guy cool, that guy cool? You know, you're just a cool guy. And you made it cool to be a Red. I've often wondered, you know, you're not one of those guys who's putting on this facade for other people. But in a much more limited role, in my case, in my job, I found it hard sometimes to always be on, if you know what I'm saying. Okay, and what I mean by that, you go to dinner. You go to a town where you got some friends there that you haven't seen in a while, and you're excited to catch up with them. And yes, they're friends, but maybe you got in at 2 a.m. the night before on a trip, and the next day you got to be on. Was it ever hard to be on as much as people probably expected you to be?
No, not for me. I mean, I could see other guys getting just totally ground down in life by whether it was going to a restaurant and people wanted to talk to you. You know, I remember playing in Boston, and one of the reasons David Wells didn't want to be there is because he said, man, I've been a Yankee for a long time. And he said, this is insanity here in New England. I walk into a restaurant, and he said, sometimes the whole place stands up and cheers, and sometimes they all look at me like I'm the devil because I got beat yesterday, right? And, you know, that type of pressure, you know, could drive some guys out of town or out of the game sometimes. But for me personally, you know, I had been in that weight room since I was a little kid with my father and been thinking about these things. And I also was somehow in my very young youth. I mean, this is 7 and 8 years old. I can remember my mother would be playing tennis in the Keys, and I would go with her, and I would hit a tennis ball against the wall for an hour, you know, but I'd be tired of it. And maybe I would observe, you know, an 80-year-old lady sitting on a bench in the park, and I would go sit next to her, and I would coax a conversation out of her. And I always had this sense that when I left that interaction, that she had a good time because I was asking her questions about her life, and she was telling me these stories, and she was also making me feel good in that moment. I figured that out at a really young age. And so for me to be out there and have to be on means that I'm like interacting with fans at a bar or at a restaurant or at the stadium or my teammates and having to pull the load for them. But I always observed that people didn't want to pull the load for someone else. They were a little selfish in that way. And for whatever reason, I just popped out of the box thinking the opposite way. And I always loved being on, being out, interacting with fans in a way that a college kid could walk away from me and say, man, that guy just talked to me like he's known me my whole life. And I saw so many players blow people off that I purposely went in the other direction even harder, even though I was already made that way since I was a kid. And so for me, it was easy, and it still is easy to just deliver the goods to people, to do what you say you're going to do, to bring some energy to a conversation and let people suck off that energy, because I just know life is hard, and you see it everywhere. You know, people have problems with anxiety and depression, and all those things still happen in big league locker rooms, even though these are young guys who have great families and are making a lot of money. But, you know, it can be hard at times, and I just didn't have a hard time with it. So I just enjoyed kind of giving that love out to the world.
All right, last 2 questions. Tell me one thing about Bronson Arroyo that perhaps through the years you've seen a pattern where people think that Bronson Arroyo is X, fill in the blank, and he's nowhere close to being X.
The one thing that permeated my whole career was that they thought I was a partier, right? And I remember we were in Arizona. I was out with Ryan Ludwig at my favorite bar in the whole city, right next to the hotel there. It was you just walk past the steakhouse.
I know what you're talking about. Yep.
Nice little quiet spot. And we got back in my room that night, and he said, Bronson, I told my wife that I wish I would have hung with you more this year. This was like late August. And she said, why would you want to hang with Bronson? He seems like a partier. And he said, yeah, I don't know what to tell you. The couple times I've been out with him, he's having a good time, but he's drinking water most of the time, and he has 1 or 2 beers, and he's totally in control. Like you think this guy's like out there, out of control, chasing women and drinking a lot, and he's not, right? And what people got wrong about me was that I love humans. I love interacting with people. I love giving that love and that conversation that I can have with people at a bar, drop my guard and be myself, and have 1 Corona and then a bunch of waters because I know I'm going to the ballpark the next day to get a good workout in, right? And so people mistake me being out as being a partier, and it really wasn't the way that I operated.
That's fascinating. And look, that I've already had you more time than I had asked of you already, so I don't want to go into that. But I think that's something that down the road we can get into, because when people think that something like that about you, it's funny because when you travel with a major league team, I remember being out with some guys who were players back in the days when I'd have a few beers with the players every now and again, and there might have been 1 or 2 of these guys that maybe they were doing some things that they shouldn't have been doing, and I wasn't comfortable being around it, but because you were around it, you're thrown in and you're lumped in. That happens for everybody in life, and I think it's safe to say with a guy like you, it's not a surprise to hear you say, because I saw you. You weren't out there partying in the whole 9 yards, but people think he's got the long hair, he's single, he's in a band, he's a music guy, he's all these things. He looks like he might be a partier, and I think that's fantastic. You've had a chance on this show to share that with people, because I think that's really important for people to know. Reds Hall of Fame. You get elected, first year up. You tell me, is this like one of the great moments in your professional career?
Absolutely. I'm honestly, I lean a little bit like Eddie Vedder from Pearl Jam, who stood up there the first time they got a Grammy, and he said, I'm going to say something now, and I'm going to say for the whole band, it's typically me. He said, I don't think this means anything. He said, you can't really, judge art. And I kind of lean that way. I'm a bit humble. I don't really love the accolades. But to think about a kid who was in the weight room at such a young age and threw that tennis ball against the wall, dreaming of pitching in a World Series or playing shortstop and doing a backflip like Ozzie Smith, I had been dedicated to that craft for such a long time. And to see that come to fruition, not only through the minor leagues, into the major leagues, to win a World Series, to win a Gold Glove, to be an all-star for one time, and to now be inducted into a place with the oldest team in the game, where guys like Pete Rose and Johnny Bench and Joe Morgan, sit, is the culmination of my life's work. And if there is something worth holding a trophy up for, that's it. To say, hey man, all this work I did, my life's work, if it's embodied here in this one trophy or this picture of my face, it means a lot. It also, when you think about your life, when I think about my life, part of the reason I play music is because I think there's a chance that a great grandkid or a great niece or nephew might pop in a CD and listen to Bronson Arroyo sing versus popping in a VCR tape and watch me pitch. I think there's a chance they'd listen to the music first, right? So part of leaving a legacy here on the planet, because we're all going to be nothing one day, right? I mean, 1,000 years from now, some kid's not going to even know who Adolf Hitler is, right? And so the guys like Derek Jeter and the biggest names in the game at one time, they're not going to exist anymore, except for maybe in a statue in some museum. And to be inside the Reds Hall of Fame and have my face on that wall, alongside these other 90 great players that have been here and announcers like your father, is something that makes me proud. It gives me goosebumps when I think about it, and that's hard to do for me.
Bronson, we're so happy for you, so excited for you in the induction and the election, and we thank you for your time today, man. This has been awesome.
I appreciate it, Thom, man. I'm glad to see you're doing a show like this, because I've always thought that you were not only was your voice beautiful to listen to, but you go about your craft in the right way, man. And I enjoyed being on here with you. Thank you.
I appreciate it. Bronson Arroyo, kind enough to join us. We asked him to join us for 45 minutes. We ended up keeping him a lot longer than that. But I think we could have kept him. I think everybody agrees. I mean, we could have kept this guy on another 2 hours. That's the best And my dad's been on this big interview. That's the best interview we've had so far.